Okay, so we're going to start with an introduction to Blender. This is Blender 2.83 LTS. LTS standing for long-term support. So the Blender Foundation now supports the release of 2.83. This would basically give us more confidence for bigger projects. So it's a major release. So inside, first boot up, we are able to access this little window. This window can be hidden away if you don't want it to start up with it, but it's handy for setting yourself with a new file. The general file, which is the one we're going to look at, is the default layout for Workspaces. So I'm just click General, and Blender's famous for giving you a cube, a camera and a light. And pretty much every tutorial you'll see out there will revolve around you pressing A to select everything, X to delete everything. Okay. You can set your first start to literally be an empty scene, which is exactly what this is. So let me take you through what we have. On the top bar we have File, Edit, Render. These are sort of the default standard menus. Unlike Maya, you don't have an extremely long list of menus. Basically you have 4 menus: File, Edit, Render, Window, and then of course Help. Inside File, straightforward things. Inside Edit, pretty much the same. You may spend a lot of time with Preferences. Blender is a package that's constantly in flux and development, and add-ons are put forward all the time. But the Blender Properties does give us a quick insight into some of the other things. So we have Interface, where we can change certain things. We have Themes, where we can change different theme colors and so on. The Viewport layouts, the lights, the editing, animation. And these are great. I strongly suggest that we always have our animation set to linear and then change it to whatever interpolation type we might want afterwards. The add-ons is where the magic happens, and you can type in add-ons, and it does come with quite a large set of add-ons. I suppose this would be the plugins inside Maya, and then of course your system in here, so you can turn on things. So I've got 2060 card here, so I can say that my cycles render device will be using the RTX, which is good, and that we'll be using optics, which gives us some experimental features. It speeds up render times, and we can set some of the other bits and pieces in here. So as we move forward, there's obviously rendering, and there's different windows, new windows and things like that we can pull out. When you go into Maya, you have different workspaces that come up over here. The workspaces, well, the workspaces for Blender are held on these tabs, and you can add your own workspaces. You can create your own workspace and basically save it here, but default is layout. Then you'd be modeling. These do change just ever so slightly, so you can see they do change certain bits. The sculpting one, because I've got nothing in the scene, I'll just add the cube back. This is where we would create. We'd have our geometry, and we'd be able to use the blend sculpt mode. So we'd be in sculpting, and we'd be able to do some sculpting in here. There's not enough divisions in this, so we wouldn't actually be able to sculpt much. We'd need to do some subdivision first. So I'll just drop back to the general. So we've got sculpting, we've got UV editing. The UV editing has been vastly improved in recent times. You'll notice it's dropped us straight into edit mode for the object, which is obviously different to Maya. Maya, you have to tell it to do certain things. We have texture painting, and again, if we created a texture, we'd be able to directly paint straight on. This is, I find, more intuitive than Maya's setup. We have shading. This is using high dynamic range setup so that we can test our shaders. It allows us to work with the principal shader. The shader's down here, and Blender's pretty cool that it works with directly with nodes, and it's quite intuitive. So if you're an Unreal Engine or you're working with if you're working with Substance, you'll be familiar with how that things plug together and build things up. We have an animation, which sets us with the camera, and we have a rendering, and again this is just showing us the rendering result. We haven't done any rendering. We have compositing, and if we had nodes, we turn the nodes on, we'd have the render result, and we'd be able to add different nodes. Very similar to Fusion, and similar to Nuke in the way that it works there. and then finally there's a scripting portal for us to work with. So I'm going to drop back to layout, and in layout you can see that layout we're in object mode, modeling we're in edit mode, so it's just something to notice, and there's a couple of bits and pieces to look at as we move in this. So down the left hand side, very similar to Maya, we've got our select box tools. There is a cursor tool. So the previous versions of Blender, the cursor was the 3D cursor was extremely important, and wherever you put the 3D cursor was where things happened. It's still important, but it can not be used, so it's quite sensible in a sense for a Maya user now, or a Max user. You don't need to worry too much about the 3D cursor, although it does become quite useful when you learn how to use it. We have the transform tools, so there's the move tool, and it gives you a gizmo that you can use, very much similar to Maya, and you can drag along planes, or you can float drag depending on where you select. There's also hotkeys. Blender is very strong on hotkeys, so the G key is for grab. And if you use G and then one of the axes, so Z for instance, then it will only lock to the axes. So it's quite useful if you're wanting to do like incremental movements of things. And if you use the control key, you will incrementally lock, sort of snap in increments. So it's going to snap in increments of one unit. And if you don't want to actually commit to the move or whatever has gone off, if you just press the left mouse click, it will revert back to where it was originally. And again, I find that quite useful. So if you're just playing around with things, and the same can be said for the rotate button as well. So there's a rotate button, and again the hotkey for this. So if I just Control Z to undo, hotkey for this as you look over it is R. So we can go R, and we've got the rotate, and it will rotate around the axis that we're actually working on. But if we press the right mouse button, we don't commit to that. And then S for scale. So if we press the S for scale, we can scale up. And again, we can not commit. If we zoom out a little bit, it's contextualized, so it'll work better. So the further away we are, the easier it is to control. And it also works with the locking mechanism. So if I do S and Y, I'm only going to scale across the Y-axis. So that's pretty cool. Then we have the global transform tool. So again, very much like Maya, you can do your rotations, you can do your scaling, you can do your moving, and it all works within there. I'll just undo those. So also what we have, we're moving around inside this 3D. So this is a 3D window, 3D viewport. Blender treats the camera and the viewport as two different things. So any viewport you can snap a camera to it. But I can't render this picture as I see it now as I would if in Maya. We'd be moving the camera around. So very similar to Maya, it has some controls that involve keyboard and mouse. So to tumble the viewport, you just middle mouse click and hold. If you want to track the viewport, so tracking or panning, then you would hold down Shift and you would hold down the middle mouse button. And if you want to dolly in and out of the viewport, then you can use the scroll wheel in and out, or you can use Control with the middle mouse wheel as well. So just click and the middle mouse with Control, and you'll dolly in and out. But again, it's not like the Maya camera where it's beholden to the actual camera that you've got in the scene. If I go to camera view, which is this little icon here, I will drop to camera, and if I begin to move or to tumble, I will actually detach from that camera. So pressing this button just moves your viewport to whatever the actual camera is. And something to remember. If you want to, you can actually bind the viewport and the camera together. So there's a little pull-out window here, there's a little tab. If you just remember that the N key brings this out and puts it back. Under view, you can actually turn lock camera to view on, and then when I'm doing my tumbling or I'm doing my tracking, I can set my camera up. So this is a useful way of doing the camera setup. Then you can turn that off and then you're free again. Or you can leave it on. It's entirely up to you, but just remember to release yourself from the camera. You can have the grid in orthographic view or in perspective mode. You can use this to do your grab tracking, and you can do this also to dolly in and out, which is pretty cool. So there's some little, if you get stuck with the viewport controls. It's very easy. So that's the left side more or less covered. There's a few little bits underneath, so we've got some great little tools for annotating. So if you've got a Wacom tablet, you could say, you know, you could put some notes on the screen for people. So like this cube. I'm not using a Wacom, unfortunately, so lots of clicking, and we'll just point to that. And it's because of the grease pencil, it stays in, and of course we can actually erase that as well. So we can annotate, erase, so we can just rub that out. And it doesn't really affect anything, but it's useful if you're doing edits. So you know, if you're doing an edit and you want to just write some quick notes into the scene, you can do and pass them on. It's fairly decent. We can also do measurements as well. So you can measure pretty simply, and you can lock to the just turn on now snapping. You could snap that along the bottom there. And then just very simple stuff. And then obviously there's hard ops. So these are some add-ons that I've got just installed that I've been testing out. So moving across, moving throughout this, so we can go into edit mode. As you see, there's the tab key, brings edit mode in. And when you go into edit mode, you get some context different stuff in here. So at the moment we're in edit mode points, which is number 1 on your key line. Number 2 is edit edges. Number 3 is edit faces. Something to note that when you're selecting faces, the culling is on by automatic. So if you want to go into X-ray mode, then that's how you would select across all of those. Sort of do a group selection type thing. And then from there you could add an extrusion. Undo that, and if I hold down extrude along normals, then I can extrude out things like this. The hotkeys work pretty well, so learning the hotkeys is useful. So if I go into the edge select mode, and if I was to use the bevel key, you can see Control B is on there, so Control B onto the edit mode, and I'm able to actually start the edit just by not pressing anything, just pulling the mouse. But I can also edit the bevel by rolling the mouse. So I can add more divisions. When you've actually done an edit, you actually get a little custom menu. This will disappear once you click away from it, so you only get this once, but it does give you some options. These options are very similar to the modifiers. Now we'll have a look at those in a bit. But this is a one-time deal, so it's just looking at this. So I can tumble around, track, and everything else. But the moment I left mouse click, this will disappear. So if I wanted this to be a 0.5 bevel, pretty standard. And I wanted to make sure that I had 6 segments, and let's say we wanted it to be arced on the inside edges. I don't know why we would, or maybe we want it to patch or arc out, for instance, or we want to set the strength to whatever it is, cut off or grid fill. Some of these, depending on how we've set this up with different segments and whatever else. These have a width, perception, width, depth, or percentage. So the percentage, you can actually do a percentage of, and you get different bevel types, which is useful. The moment I click off that, then you can see that that's now gone. I can't get that back. But I can move on to the next tool. And there's all sorts of useful tools down here, tools that rip the regions and so on. Very standard box modeling type tools, but quite powerful. And if I go in out of my shader mode, I can right mouse click on this, and if I go into object mode, right mouse click on this and say shade smooth, you see we've got some smooth shading happening on there as well. So we've got the smooth shading happening. The hard edges sort of disappeared, so we would need to address those with maybe some creases and work with those. So that's how we move around inside here. Inside, when you're inside here, so one thing we don't have is we don't have a sort of a toolbar sort of thing full of little icons, but we've got the add menu. So the add menu basically is the same as the toolbar. Everything is available. Shift A is the add menu, and depending on which setup you're in, whether you're in compositing or shading or whatever else, the Shift A will work, but it will be context sensitive. So Shift A, I could add a mesh, and inside there I could add, say, an icosphere, and I could move the icosphere up. So one thing to remember is we've got the transform tools here, so this would be the outliner window. This would be like our outliner window, and this is coming under the object properties. If I actually just grab this and move this up, then we're moving up 2.6 meters. And if I do any scaling or anything, I have to be careful because the scaling does affect some of the modifiers. So you will find a lot of tutorials, they advise, because the pivot position's gone with the object, and because of Blender 2.7 less, whatever they were, that a lot of tutorials will go into edit mode. So if we go into this, we can see this. They'll be in edit mode, they'll have the point selected, and then they will move the object, and the pivot point stays where it is. But you can see that this has moved in local space, but it's not moved the actual transform the object. So a lot of tutorials do that. Again, it's interesting how and why and whatever else, but it's a bit strange sometimes for a Maya user to get your head around, but there is a reason for doing it. While we're in the outliner, so I'll just tab out of that, just worth looking at this. So this is the outliner, as you can see, it's up here. Inside here is pretty much exactly the same as a Maya outliner. This is a useful tool. You can actually deselect the overlays, so you can turn them on or off basically point blank. So it's useful when you're looking at look dev and things like that. So inside here, if I wanted to select the cube, I can select the cube by just pressing the cube or the camera or the icosphere or the light. There's the light in there. If I want to go to the rendered view, this is the rendered view. I've still got the measure tool on. So inside the render view, the light properties would be underneath. So as you can see, I've selected the light, but I've still got the icosphere selected, and that's because I didn't select the light. So you've got to sort of look at this. If you want to change the properties, you have to select it from up here. It can be annoying sometimes, but it means you can bring up other properties at times as well, so you can switch around a bit. So this one is now selecting them. So we're now into the cube mode for the parameters. We can go into shading mode or the light mode. If we go up here, we can change the color. We could change the the power in the wattage of the power. So let's put it at 2200. So we're getting a different sort of light effect. We can change the type of light. So we can change it to an area light, and so on. So we get a different set of shadows coming out of that. Or maybe it's a sunlight, or maybe it's a point light, a spotlight, so on. So there's straightforward things, very much similar to Maya. Unlike Maya, you don't have to. Every light does cast shadows because the EV renderer is pretty cool, pretty powerful. If we are using EV, we can turn on things like ambient occlusion, screen space reflections. So if I was to, let's just give this a metallic texture like this, you can see that we're getting the reflectivity coming through that. So there we've got a nice metally looking texture. It's pretty good. These two, if I go in here, add a modifier, we'll just add a subdivision surface modifier and turn that up in the viewport, maybe shade. If we went to the shader, you can see there's nothing attached to this shader. It's not got the same material, so we just need to click a new material. And then this material might be a different colour, and also probably has a bit of metallic in there as well. You can see that the material is obviously with the roughness. If I turn that down, you can see we get this really nice shiny real-time reflections going on. And that's the EV renderer. It's pretty good. What else is there? So so render properties, lots of useful things. This is obviously using the EV engine. If I change this to the cycles engine, I need to be on rendered tab, then what's going to happen is it's going to do an approximation in real time of the cycles renderer. So the cycles renderer would, just pressing F12, would actually go off and compete with the graphics card and would pump out whatever it is at current settings of 4K, I believe. The difference is EV, pretty much real time. Sometimes you need cycles, sometimes you need EV. Currently on CPU, I need to be on GPU, so it's a lot faster with my GPU. EV's just automatically on your GPU. So there's a lot of cool things. These do change when you're using different renderers. You can see these do change. Things like simplify, motion blur, and so on do change. So it's worth noting. If you're in some tutorials, you might notice that some things disappear. I've only got 16 iterations inside the viewport, and this can be up to, so we could pump this up to 32 depending on your graphics cards. And I've also got denoising on. I might want it on or off depending on how you want. EV renderer and the Cycles renderers do use a denoising function, which is pretty powerful. Probably be better just to show you that off when it's when you're doing a rendering tutorial. But just coming down this stack, we've got the properties that are for output. So this is what you're going to be rendering out. So currently it's a PNG, but we could render straight out to an MPEG video, and we could go into the encoding. We can change the encoding inside to MPEG-4. You can set the quality up. So literally you can go straight to YouTube or whatever else with your encoding. It's pretty powerful. And if you're using the EV renderer, renders tend to happen almost in real time depending on the complexity of the scene. Then you have your view layer properties. So view layers are, I'm just starting to get to grips with view layers, but essentially these are your render layers, and you can use them for creating some really complex compositing effects, which is pretty cool. So that's something to be looking at. And then as we're moving down the stack, we have our scene properties. So in here you can turn gravity on and off, and there's all sorts of little bits and pieces. Which camera you're going to use. So if you've got multiple cameras, you can switch between your cameras in there. Which background scene you might want to pull something in. You might have it on a different scene layer, so you might have two different layers. And again, you can multiply up how you bring together the project. We've also got the world properties, so this is where you can change your background color. So again, for look development, say for instance if we were adding in here, let's go into emission and drag this up, so you can see we can use the emission shader in there, or we could actually just change that from a principled BSDF to an emission shader, and then you can start to really crank this up to say like 25. And of course we've got glow, everything's starting to happen. And yeah, this is where you start to say, why am I using Maya? When you're creating look dev, it's very interesting at this point. So there's a ton of stuff, and again you can do some pretty cool stuff with that. Then you've got your object properties. So this would be the object properties for the icosphere. I'm selecting the cube. I'm still able to select. It's like I'm selecting from a render. The modifier properties, so yeah, we added a modifier which was a subdivision surface. This was to the icosphere. Then on top of that I could then start adding other things. So for instance, let's shift, so let's just shift D, and we'll just move this off to the side, and then we'll bring this down. So maybe it'd be better if we could actually see what we were doing. And of course my pivot point is down here, so I'm just going to set my origin to the center of the mass. Again, it's just, I think when you've used things like Maya and whatever else, it's useful. So in this one we might want to add a boolean, and we might want a boolean from the cube, and we want to do an intersect, and there you go. So we've just put an intersect in there. And you can see that the intersect has got two parts to that going on. So we've got the icosphere there, and we've got the cube here. So this might be good for if we wanted to create sort of like that shape. So just show you what that shape looks like. So it's create a pretty good boolean, and then from that you might want to then do a remesh, where we would start to remesh this, and the remesh would be currently looking at voxels. Let's do blocks, and we might want to change the octree so that we get some better blocks or block sizes in there. So depending on how you want to create whatever it is you're wanting to create, and then you go back to your look dev, and then you see what that looks like, and that would be pretty cool. Further down we've got particles, we've got physics properties, we've got constraints, and all of these act as sort of modifiers, so you can just apply them to each other. So you could have one orientating to another. It's pretty straightforward stuff, very similar to Maya in a lot of ways. And then obviously there's object data properties. So this is looking at the data groups that are in there, if there's any UV maps and things. and so on. The shaders we've already looked at, and textures. And then to top it all off, at the bottom we've got a timeline, which is pretty cool. There's a lot of stuff you can do with the timeline that relates to your output. So you get your output up here, change that to 240, whatever it is, and you can see that changes down here. So that's Blender 101 as you're moving through very quickly, just to get your head around it, trying to compare it to Maya where I can. I've used Maya since its inception at beta, which is a very long time ago, and I'm loving Blender at the moment. So it's fair to say that, you know, this is a progressive piece of software, and there's tons of cool stuff coming out our way.